Anirban Basu is Chairman and CEO of Sage Policy Group, an economic and policy consulting firm. He has lectured at Johns Hopkins University, most recently in global strategy, and has also taught international economics, urban economics, micro and macroeconomics at Johns Hopkins. Anirban will supply in-depth analysis of the major factors shaping economic outcomes, including elevated inflation, lingering pandemic, worker shortages, war in Europe, rising interest rates, and stepped-up infrastructure spending. Please make welcome Dr. Anirban Basu.
Righto, can you hear me? Yeah, good. So let's talk about the economy. After I follow a speaker like John O'Leary, I don't enjoy it. He was awesome. I preferred to have the previous speaker be very inadequate and to look good by comparison, of course. But that, unfortunately, is not my fate today. He made me feel joyful on the one hand and really unhappy with myself on the other. I realize I've been insufficiently kind, insufficiently engaged, insufficiently thankful, and I really mean it. I'm going to change my life, given what he said. I'm going to change my life just as soon as this presentation ends. So I will leave some time at the end of this presentation for Q&A, so please think about what questions you'd like to ask. I think you use the app for that. My presentation today is entitled No Time to Buy. This is a James Bond-themed presentation. You'll see that theming throughout this presentation, whether you like it or not. I hope you don't hate it. It is firmly baked within the cake. Lots to cover here. You saw, heard during the introduction, I'll be covering a lot of topics, whether war, construction materials prices, the issue of whether or not we're in recession already, all these things I'll address. Lots of places to begin, of course, the discourse on the economy. I could begin with Russia and Ukraine, or Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan, or whatever it happens to be. But all of these things relate to market fragility and also influence one of the most salient aspects, the most salient aspect actually of economic life in recent months, which is the specter of inflation. And that's where I'm going to begin, talking about inflation. It has been the singularly most defining characteristic of the US economy in recent months. It is shaping both supply-side dynamics and demand-side dynamics. I'll talk about that a lot as I go through the presentation. Somewhere out there in America, probably there's a millennial who thought, at least pre-pandemic, well, inflation is always 2%. That's what it is. It's 2%. Why do we even measure it? It's always 2%. But those of us who grew up during the 1970s into the early 1980s know that it need not be 2%, has certainly not been 2% recently. This is your consumer price index. There are two lines here, and much of the data I will show you, by the way, today are time series data, so the more contemporary data are to the right of the slide. This is percentage change, 12-month basis. So the line that ends at the top there is your all items consumer price index. Over the last 12 months, which we have data, that is, say, through June, consumer prices rising 9.1%, as you know, a more than 40-year high. The so-called core inflation rate is depicted in the lighter blue shaded line there. It ends at 5.9%. And actually, there was some good news last month. Core inflation, which is all items minus food and energy. We economists occasionally like to subtract out food and energy prices from such computations because food and energy prices are volatile and also susceptible to non-economic influences like Vladimir Putin, as it turns out, but also natural disaster and weather. But either way you look at it, a 40-year high in inflation, and certainly not 2%. And this bout of inflation has come as a surprise to virtually all economists, including economists who should have known better. I speak, of course, about the folks at the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States. Those folks actually influence inflationary outcomes in our society. They actually shape our monetary policy, our money supply, at their Federal Open Market Committee meetings. They're effectively predicting something, or have been, that they influence. And yet they also missed it. Now, this bout of inflation begins roughly in the spring of 2021. By the summer of 2021, inflation in this country is running at a 6% year-over-year pace. Here are some statements that came out of Federal Open Market Committee meetings around that time, beginning with June of 2021 on the northwest side of the slide, that corner of the slide. And so back then, the statement from the Federal Reserve was, quote, inflation has risen, largely reflecting transitory factors. Now, transitory, a synonym for transitory is fleeting. So the notion was this is highly temporary, but not only that, this is simply the reopening of the economy from the pandemic. This is some lingering supply chain issues. They'll go away very quickly. They always have. And so we at the Federal Reserve don't have to do anything about this. It's going to go away on its own. Don't worry about it. By July of 2021, the statement is inflation has risen, largely reflecting transitory factors. Nothing has changed. By September, the statement is inflation is elevated, largely reflecting transitory factors. So they took the time to change the word risen to elevated, because it rose during the spring of 2021, remains elevated into the fall of 2021, but the key word here is still transitory. But now this definition of fleeting is being stretched. And by November of 2021, the statement is inflation is elevated, largely reflecting factors that are expected to be transitory. And now, for the first time, they're realizing we could be wrong. We've been telling the American people it's simply temporary, it's going to go away on its own. It may not. And now, all of a sudden, they've been telling the American people, we've got this under control. Please stop sending us your emails. Please stop making nasty TikToks about us. But now they're saying we might have a problem. And by December, just 1 month later, the statement is completely transfigured. Supply and demand imbalances related to the pandemic and the reopening of the economy have continued to contribute to elevated levels of inflation. The word transitory, you'll notice, is dead, gone, and buried. But not only have they pivoted in terms of their language, they've not pivoted in terms of policymaking. They're now saying that we have to do something about this. We have to tighten monetary policy. We have to raise interest rates. Now, around this time, December of 2021, not that long ago, we're only in early August of 2022, but around this time, there was a conventional wisdom among Wall Street economists that the Federal Reserve might have to raise rates 3 times in 2022, meaning 3 quarter-point equivalents. The first economist of note who I heard suggested it might be 4 times is a guy named Jan Hatzius. Jan Hatzius is the chief economist at Goldman Sachs. And he's at Goldman Sachs, so his house is bigger than mine, but he does not drive a Mustang. In any case, he says that it might be 4 times, meaning quarter-point equivalents. The current prevailing wisdom is that this year the Federal Reserve will end up raising rates 13 times in terms of quarter-point equivalents. And that completely alters the economic dynamics of the economy and, of course, any forecasting. Now, a separate statement comes out from our Federal Reserve Chairman, Jerome Powell, out of that December meeting. He says, quote, these problems have been larger and longer lasting than anticipated, meaning we were surprised. We've been telling the American people for the better part of a year, it's simply temporary, it's simply transitory. Turns out we were wrong. Exacerbated by waves of the virus, not our fault. This is Delta, this is Omicron. We're not genetic epidemiologists, we're not virologists. Who would have known? Who could have known? As a result, overall inflation is running well above our 2% longer run goal and will likely continue to do so well into next year. Well, they got that right. It has been. And will continue to. Yes, we might have hit peak inflation. We'll talk about that. I expect inflation to subside. You've noticed what's happened with oil prices. Oil prices now down to $96 a barrel this morning. Natural gas below $8 per million BTU, so on and so forth. Steel prices have fallen. Lumber prices have fallen. So we might have already achieved peak inflation, but inflation will be sticky downward. It'll stay persistent for quite some time for reasons we'll get into. Now, again, I think the Federal Reserve should have known better, and I'm engaging in some Monday morning quarterbacking on this Tuesday morning. I understand that, maybe being a bit harsh, but they actually shape these outcomes, in particular by shaping U.S. money supply graphed back to 1959. And you can see how profound the growth in money supply has been over the course of the pandemic. Now, in fundamental monetary theory, there's a basic foundational equation known as the quantity equation, also known as the equation of exchange. I like to call it the equation of exchange because that's just downright sexier. And that equation says that when you increase money supply, 2 things can happen. Either economic growth accelerates, which of course is the objective, to countervail the effects of the pandemic, for instance, and or price growth accelerates, meaning inflation. But here's the thing, as they were increasing money supply, what do we know was going on? Not enough equipment, not enough materials, not enough workers, supply chain disruptions, not enough truck drivers, not enough port handling capacity in Los Angeles or Savannah, Georgia, or elsewhere. So as they're raising money supply, the supply side of the economy was constrained. Growth could only be so great. So what took on much of the burden of equilibrating that equation? Prices. So the same people who've been telling you it's merely transitory are the same people who basically guaranteed it would not be, it could not be. And meanwhile, I should not ignore the fact that the federal government is stimulating the economy itself with $6 trillion of spending. The Federal Reserve could see this, nonetheless. They continue to bulk up money supply, and here we are. Now, you will note that more recently, they have put the brakes on money supply growth. They're behind the curve. They're now racing to raise interest rates, racing to shut down money supply growth. And of course, that has implications for borrowing costs for real estate and construction, and we'll talk about that throughout this presentation. I'm not suggesting to anyone here, parenthetically, that the only reason we've had this bout of durable inflation is because of money supply or monetary policy generally. There have been other issues, quite surprising issues. For instance, lingering supply chain disruptions. This is the Census Bureau's Small Business Pulse survey developed during the pandemic itself, just to try to determine how small businesses are faring in America. The question on the table here is, in the last week, did this business have any of the following? The red line, domestic supplier delays. Now, this is through April. The Census Bureau is now retooling the survey. This is through April. But notice no improvement here month after month after month. We've been living in this world where if you want it, it's going to be there for you just in time. But all of a sudden, for various reasons, the supply chain is not able to handle that. We'll talk again more about these dynamics. The blue line there represents foreign supplier delays, but still very elevated. In many cases, getting worse as the pandemic went on. This is inflationary, of course, because this lack of supply chain smoothness in operations translates into scarcity, and of course, scarcity translates into higher prices. People compete over scarce goods. The sheer nature of the economic expansion to date has been inflationary. This is quarterly gross domestic product. Graph back to 1990. Some complexity on this slide, unfortunately. Two vertical axes. The blue color bar is indexed to the left-hand vertical axis. The red color bar is indexed to the right. And you'll notice that the numbers on the right-hand vertical axis are just much more massive to accommodate the volatility of the economy over the course of this pandemic. Reading from left to right, the last blue-colored bar here is the fourth quarter of 2019, the last quarter before we shut down the economy. We had momentum going into 2020, you'll remember. This nation added jobs in January of 2020, at 376,000 jobs in February of 2020, shuts down its economy in March of 2020. March of 2020 is embodied by the first quarter of 2020, here depicted by the first red-colored bar, reading from left to right, the first quarter of 2020, and during that quarter, the U.S. economy shrinks 5% on an annualized basis. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's big news by itself. For instance, during the fourth quarter of 2008, which had been the worst quarter of our economic lives, the U.S. economy shrinks 8.4% on an annualized basis. So a negative 5% print's a big deal. A newsmaker in and of itself. Unfortunately, this time around, it is merely the appetizer for during the second quarter of 2020, the U.S. economy shrinks 31.4% on an annualized basis. That's that red bar that you see slumping to the south of the slide. And around this time, there's a furious debate that breaks out in the economics community. What would the initial phase of recovery look like? Would it be U-shaped, L-shaped, Nike swoosh, check mark, square root, hockey stick? It was a straight up V. For during the third quarter of 2020, the U.S. economy grows 33.4% on an annualized basis. At no point has the supply chain been able to handle that rate of growth. For many quarters thereafter, you'll notice high single digits in terms of growth rates. In a country that normally grows 2 to 3%, supply side could not handle it. You'll also notice that during the last two quarters for which we have data, the first and second quarters of 2022, the U.S. economy shrinks. 1.6%, negative 1.6% during the first quarter, negative 0.9% during the second, of course, ushering forth this debate about whether or not we're in recession. I will say to you that I don't think we are, but I think we're headed there. But let me give you the forecast later. Let me not jump the gun on that forecast. Now, we've talked about a number of things that help explain this inflation and its durability: money supply and monetary policy, supply chain disruptions, which persist, as everyone in the room knows, and the sheer nature of the economic recovery, which by and large has been very rapid until the last 6 months. But we need to talk about at least one other factor. We need to talk about at least one other factor to more completely explain why this inflationary episode has been so enduring. And that factor relates to the behavior and dynamics of the US labor market. Let's talk about that now. Now, one of the things that we get from the government, the federal government, each and every month, are data from the JOLTS survey, the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey. That survey indicates that in May, America was home to 11.3 million available unfilled jobs. In May, America home to 1.9 job openings for every unemployed American. This is still very much the land of opportunity. If you want a job in America, there's one waiting for you. In fact, there's two. Now, we just got this morning the June 2022 data on job openings, and that slumps by 600,000 to 10.7 million, actually 10.698 million job openings. So the number of job openings now is fading. In construction, in May, there were 405,000 available unfilled jobs. In June, 334,000. So we also see this in construction, fading demand for workers, particularly the residential segment as the housing market, the single-family housing market has slowed dramatically. Nonetheless, even at 10.7 million job openings, there are plenty of job openings in America. Before the pandemic, when the economy was red hot, there were about 7 million job openings in America. And one of the reasons it's been so hard, so challenging to find workers to fill available positions, including in construction, is that the size of the US labor force has shrunk over time. In absolute terms, the labor force has shrunk by about 500,000 people over the course of the pandemic. This is the same statement, but made in percentage terms. This is the US labor force participation rate. Graph back to 1950. This is a representation of the proportion of working age adults who are either working or looking for work. Parenthetically, you will notice how rapid the labor force participation rate grows during the late 1960s through the 70s and 1980s. As women join the labor market en masse, this is the moment during which America transitions largely from single income households to dual income households. Some of you might remember the television show 30-something, which aired first in 1987, which is about a lot of these dual income families living in the Philadelphia suburbs, and because people were so busy working, they didn't have enough time for each other or even to pick up dry cleaning. It was not a very deep show, but featured very good-looking people, and that was the secret of its success, ran for 4 years. Now, this pattern of rising labor force participation ends with the turn of the millennium. Since that time, generally speaking, labor force participation rate has been in decline. Now, during the late teens, the economy is red hot, wages are rising, lots of job openings, and so people are being induced back in the labor market. But then the pandemic strikes, the labor force participation rate goes from 63.4% pre-pandemic to 60.2% as 8 million people leave the labor force. Some have come back, of course, many, but the labor force participation rate still is stuck at 62.2%. And some industries have been more impacted by the departure of workers than others. One of the sources of this departure has been the early retirement of many baby boomers. Many baby boomers retired earlier than anticipated during the early stages of the pandemic for a number of reasons, including fear of infection, but many others. And many of those baby boomers have been our finest construction workers. These are people who enter the construction trades early in life, often right out of high school. They learned a love of working with their hands and minds and equipment early in life, often in shop class in high school. Shop class typically taught by someone with enormous arms wearing a Rush t-shirt driving a Trans Am. That kind of person has been weeded out of the curriculum in favor of teaching to the test, and that does not produce enough construction workers or mechanics or other people. And so now we're left with younger workers to fill these available construction positions, and many young people are not looking in that direction as pathways to prosperity, though there are obvious pathways to prosperity. Something else has happened over the course of the pandemic. What people want or expect out of the world of work has changed. Good Hire is a background check company out of Redwood City, California. They recently conducted a survey of 3,400 Americans. If you look toward the northwest of the slide, that survey found that 68% of Americans would choose remote work options over in-office work or at the job site work. People do not want to go into work. They don't want to commute. They don't want to be with their colleagues. They do not like their colleagues. A separate survey finds that 57% of Americans find their colleagues to be annoying because they overshare, they get too personal, They take credit for one another's work, and of course they interrupt, which can happen during a Zoom meeting, of course, and typically does. Nonetheless, there's this preference for remote work. One of the things that you're going to see, lots of articles as the school year is about to begin about teacher shortages in your communities. Many of you will read articles about teacher shortages in your communities, and there'll be articles about teacher burnout, so on and so forth. But one of the other things that's happening is that now teachers, along with other folks, have other options. They don't have to go to a school or at the job setting, the job site setting. They might be able to find remote work, and a lot of Americans are aspiring toward that. In fact, if you look at the third bullet on the left-hand side here, it says 74% of Americans believe that companies not offering remote working arrangements lose major talent in the workforce. And of course, 100% of the people answering that question view themselves as major talent. But the point is, there is this push to remote work, and so for certain industries like construction, manufacturing, brick and mortar retail, hotels, restaurants, this has rendered recruitment and retention that much more challenging. And so how do employers respond to these dynamics? Wanting workers, not able to find them, well, of course, they increase compensation. This is your employment cost index, 12-month% change. And you can see how profound the growth in compensation has been over the course of this pandemic. The line at the top there, the dark blue colored line, is wage and salary growth. But lately, where we've really been seeing the inflation is on the benefit side. That's the lower blue-colored line there that surges at the very end. And this is misleading, by the way, this statistic. Why? Because there are certain benefits that employers can offer employees that are not monetized. They don't show up in any transaction. I'll give you an example. My firm is an economic consultancy located in downtown Baltimore, Maryland. We have leased about 2,400 square feet of office space there. Most of my employees are millennial economists and analysts. They're 30-somethings. And we're all working remotely presently. I'd asked my staff about a little bit less than a year ago, end of 2021, let's please go back into the office on Tuesdays and Thursdays because I'm paying rent. You don't have to go in every day, just Tuesdays and Thursdays. Let's get together, let's work the way we used to do every day, every weekday. And they said to me, boss, because that's what they call me. I don't think they actually know my name. Boss, it's a great offer. Thank you so much. It's not going to happen. Now, they're millennials, so they don't actually say it to you in that way, in that direct manner. They simply didn't show up. But the point is that I'm offering my staff the opportunity to work remotely, and that is a benefit. But it is not reflected on this kind of chart because there's no transaction there. There's no monetization there. And so actually benefit costs are probably far greater than a chart like this would reveal. The sandwich line or red line there represents total compensation growth, but you can see why that's such a source of inflation. Now, with so many job openings, with unemployment pinned to 3.6%, it's going to continue to be difficult to find workers, whether they're teachers or construction workers or other workers. And that is one of the reasons that inflation will remain sticky downward. That we may have achieved peak inflation, but it's not going to fade away anytime soon. Really quite remarkable, because if you think about the economy in terms of gross domestic product, America's fully recovered. By the second quarter of 2021, second quarter of last year, we're now in the third quarter of this year, American gross domestic product was above its pre-pandemic tally. But in terms of jobs, if you were to compare February of 2020 employment versus June of 2022, and in June of 2022, America adds 372,000 jobs, which is one of the reasons I don't think we're in recession yet. But even with that, we're down 524,000 jobs over the course of the recession. These horizontal bars represent the number of jobs added or subtracted by each of these categories over time. So what I'm trying to say here is that leisure and hospitality, which includes your hotel and restaurant worker, is down 1.3 million jobs, and yet many hotels no longer will offer turnover server, room service. What I'm trying to say is make your beds. They'll no longer do that anymore because they can't find enough people to do that work. It just gives you some sense of how shrunken the labor market has become for many industries. Construction is up 46,000 jobs, but that's almost statistically insignificantly different from zero. And yet many contractors tell me they have much greater time finding workers and retaining workers now than they did pre-pandemic. In fact, one of the fastest growing occupational categories within construction is unskilled laborer. Unskilled labor. The industry seems to have done a good job recruiting unskilled laborers. But that's no substitute for some of the skilled workers who have now departed into retirement or gone to other industries. And so it could very well be the case that one of the reasons that we see such high construction delivery prices is that for many firms, it's been hard to hold productivity constant, and in some cases probably productivity, meaning output per hour worked, is actually in decline. Now, let's just show some regional economic data. So this is percentage employment growth over the course of the pandemic for the 25 largest metropolitan areas in America. And it is a somewhat mistitled slide because there are some regions that have not added jobs over the course of the pandemic, but many have, most have at this point. February 2020 versus June of 2022. I'm just looking at the percentage difference in number of jobs supported by each of these respective economies. So at number one, Dallas, Texas. Dallas, as you know, is booming. Very business-friendly environment, high quality of life in many Dallas communities, many headquarters, and so on and so forth. Dallas has added 7.3% to its employment totals over the course of the pandemic, number one. Now, the governor of Texas is a guy named Greg Abbott. Greg Abbott, much in the news recently for many, many reasons. He was one of these governors very aggressive in keeping his state's economy as open as possible, even during the worst of the pandemic. I'm going to cherry pick here. At number 4 is Atlanta, Georgia. This Governor Brian Kemp of Georgia. Brian Kemp was the first governor in the country to reopen his economy, happened on April 20th of 2020. At number 6 is Tampa. That's Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida. Again, one of these governors very aggressive in keeping his state's economy as open as possible, hewing as close to normalcy as possible, even during the worst of the pandemic. If you've ever met Governor Ron DeSantis, probably best if you're not wearing a mask at that time. He does not like it. I'm told by his staff the worst day of the year for him, Halloween. At number 9 is Phoenix. That's Governor Doug Ducey of Arizona. Again, one of these governors very aggressive in keeping his state's economy open. So some governors were focused on retaining as much economic momentum as possible through the worst of the pandemic. Other governors more focused on the public health implications of COVID-19. At number 24 is San Francisco, losing 1.8% of its pre-existing base of employment. At number 25 is Los Angeles, who's the governor of California. Why? It's the wickedly handsome Gavin Newsom. I'm told he's wickedly handsome by my wife. Himself could be a Hollywood actor and likely presidential candidate in 2024, as it turns out. In any case, he was the last governor of the country to reopen his economy. And other governors like Andrew Cuomo of New York and governors on the East Coast in large measure, Maryland, Massachusetts, were also pretty aggressive in locking down economies. Some of those governors, by the way, Republicans. So now you would say, why are you bringing this up, Anirban? Why would this shape the economic data? We're now in August of 2022. Many of the big decisions were made back in March and April of 2020. Why does this still matter? How does this influence the data? Well, let me explain. And I'll explain myself by turning to the parable of Humpty Dumpty. Now, Humpty Dumpty was an egg, at least according to contemporary lore, but an egg with special characteristics, arms, legs, a face. Now, one day, Humpty Dumpty's sitting on a wall, minding his own business, public property, by the way, no trespass. And somebody comes up behind Humpty Dumpty, probably Vladimir Putin, and pushes him off that wall. Now, Humpty Dumpty's an egg, so guess what? He cracks. Now, all the king's horses and all the king's men come rush to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. Now, I'm not sure where the horses were there. They've got no hands. They could only make the matters much, much worse. Think scrambled eggs. But even the men could not do it. And my point is very simple. The economy is an egg, and it's been hard to reconstitute that egg. We broke it with good reason, perhaps, but it was broken. But it was less broken in certain communities, Phoenix, Tampa, Atlanta, than in other communities, Los Angeles, New York, Detroit, Chicago. And so it's been hard to reconstitute, and so a lot of that reconstitution process is taking place. And it becomes very difficult, of course, as you run out of workers to help rebuild the economy, to reshape the economy into what it had been. So this next slide, same 25 major metropolitan areas, but instead of job growth in percentage terms, now rates of unemployment. And if anything, here's the issue. This is for May. We don't have the June rates yet. But if anything, what's the problem here? These rates are too low. And you say to me, Anirban, that's crazy talk. We love low rates of unemployment. Oh, yes, we do, unless we're worried about inflation. And unless we still have some recovery to do, and we do. Minneapolis, 1.6%. San Francisco has lost a ton of jobs during the pandemic, but their unemployment rate is down to 2.2%. That gives you some sense of how much the labor force has shrunk. Even Detroit Metro, 4.9%. That's low by historic standards. And the Federal Reserve sees these data and says, my goodness, here's the problem. If we want to get rid of inflation, we've got to weaken these labor markets. We've got to drive unemployment higher. And that's the process they're engaged in right now. And of course, they want to engineer a soft landing, meaning they want to slow the economy, wring inflationary pressures out of the economy or excess inflationary pressures without driving us to recession. We'll talk more about that, whether that's possible in a moment. But before we do that, let's talk about the segments in which you might have most interest, construction and real estate. And I'll start with this party. It's a party, isn't it? It's not a party, it's awful. But the point is, I'll start this part of the presentation by talking about residential data, and then I'll move to non-residential or commercial. So I began the discussion in a good place, I think, talking about the Federal Reserve. Their motivations were benign. They're not trying to trigger this bout of enduring inflation. They were trying to countervail the worst effects of the pandemic on the economy. And they do that largely by playing with interest rates, of course. Here are two interest rates of interest, the 30-year fixed mortgage rate in blue and the 15-year fixed mortgage rate in red, graphed back to the year 1995. If you look toward the right of the slide, you'll notice that during much of the pandemic, mortgage rates were at record lows. But you can also see the revenge of mortgage rates more recently. So in January, the average 30-year fixed mortgage rate was 3.22%. More recently, it's at around 5.3%, actually got up to close to 6% for a time before coming down recently. You may have heard that the bond market is acting very crazily, that we have an inverted yield curve. This morning, for instance, the yield on the 2-year Treasury is about 34 basis points above the yield on the 10-year Treasury. A lot of fancy speak to say the yield curve is inverted. Typically, longer-term interest rates are higher, but that's not the case right now. Interest rates generally, by the way, those longer-term interest rates have been falling. Short-term rates rising, long-term rates falling. Inverted yield curve is a signal of impending recession. But again, let me not get ahead of myself. Now, back to the housing market. So I'm an economist. I am accordingly in the business of forecasting. I do not like to be surprised. I do not like to admit being surprised, especially in front of fairly large audiences. But I have been surprised, not by the fact that home prices have risen during this pandemic, mind you, a pandemic that has shrunk our labor force and cost us 524,000 jobs to date, but I've been surprised by the extent to which home prices have risen during this pandemic. This is the S&P Case-Shiller U.S. National Home Price Index. And you can see how profound the rise in home prices has been during this pandemic. And many people will say to you, well, this is a straight-up bubble. This is 03, 04, 05 all over again, and we know how that ended. And for the most part, those folks would be dead wrong. This has nothing to do with 03, 04, 05, very scant similarities. Remember 03, 04, and 05? What are some of the most salient aspects, or one of the most salient aspects of 03, 04, and 05? Flawed lending. That was your subprime mortgage, that was your no-document loan. Look back at the historical data and see how many Americans missed their first mortgage payment. Got the mortgage, got the coupon book that comes along with the mortgage, never used the coupon book, not once. Flawed lending. And then home builders, collectively at least, raced to try to meet that artificially elevated demand, elevated by flawed lending. That house of cards had to tumble, of course it does. You can see that from the price action here. But during this pandemic, prices have taken off. But it's not because of the disequilibrium that existed. Too many homes built, too much lending taking place during the previous economic or major economic downturn of 2007, 2008, 2009. No, if there's a disequilibrium in the housing market, it's that we don't have enough homes available for sale. This is vacant housing units for sale. So the homeowner has left the house is available to be purchased. Look how much we had for sale back in 06, 07, 08, toward the middle of the slide. As the lending markets were shutting down because many Americans had become delinquent on their mortgages. Look at the issue now, through the first quarter. Now, we just got this morning second quarter data, and in fact, homes available for sale actually ticked up a bit by about 7% second quarter over first quarter. Nonetheless, the issue here is that we don't have enough homes for sale. So this is very different from now. It's true that in certain communities, home prices have begun to fall, Seattle, Metro, so on and so forth, and that will continue. Because these homes are priced at a 3% 30-year fixed mortgage rate, not at a 5% 30-year fixed mortgage rate. So that's going to continue. That slide will continue. Nonetheless, it's not a bubble bursting a la 06, 07, 08, not even close to that. Now, one of the things I want to do for you is I'm going to show you some leading economic indicators as I move toward the tail end of this presentation. I expect to speak for about 10 to 15 more minutes, and then we'll go to Q&A. And the reason I'm doing that, these leading economic indicators, is because I want to pivot from showing what's been happening to what's likely to happen going forward, be more forward-looking in my presentation. Here's a leading indicator. It's U.S. residential building permits. As a leading indicator, because if you're a builder, you've got to pull permits before you build. So it's an intention to build. I'll begin with the red segment here. The red segment relates to the construction of single-unit structures. That's your townhomes and single-family detached homes. Look how much we're building back in 03, 04, and 05, as builders collectively were trying to meet that artificially induced demand. The builder does not care if people can pay their mortgages or not. Once they sell the house, they're done. They're out of the transaction. Even the lenders in those cases did not care if the mortgage recipient paid back their mortgage because they sold that mortgage to somebody else. Somebody else would hold that paper. Really a flawed structure as it turns out. Again, that house of cards had to tumble, and of course it does. Great recession, global financial crisis, foreclosure crisis. And for many years, during that period and thereafter, we built very few single-family homes. Look at the red bars there. Now, something, though, is happening underneath the surface. In fact, it's happening on top of the surface at the same time. Demographics. The millennials, our largest generation, our most populous generation, are coming of age. The most common age in America this year is the age of 30. We have more 30-year-olds than any other age. Second most common age in America this year, 31. Third most common age in America this year, 29. 5 years ago, the most common age in America was 25. What do 25-year-olds do? Mostly weed. But they might rent an apartment, which lines up neatly with the apartment building boom that we saw during the previous decade. But now they're of household formation age. They're not necessarily getting married, they just live together, I suppose. They don't have kids, but they have pets, and they treat those pets like kids. And they're looking for a new type of place to live, maybe even home ownership. But we haven't built enough homes for them, so home prices, in part, have surged. And the inventory has fallen. So what do they end up doing, these millennials? They rent for lengthier periods. The blue segment here is multi-family structures, 2+ unit structures. That's apartments for the most part. Could be condominiums, but it's mostly apartments. And there we have seen some really quite strong permitting in recent months. Why? Because of demographics. The multifamily construction segment will remain one of the stronger construction segments going forward, largely because of demographics, but also because higher mortgage rates actually help that segment of the economy by keeping people pinned to apartments as opposed to home ownership for lengthier periods. Okay. That said, in certain cases, we probably have an abundance, an excess of space, and I'll get into that in this section of the presentation right now. Another leading indicator. This is the Architecture Billings Index, but this is largely viewed as a leading indicator for commercial construction. Now you see the 50-yard line running westies across that slide? By the way, I wore purple today. I don't know if you can't tell, I wore purple. People from Baltimore, when they come to Cleveland, tend to wear purple. And we tend to do a lot of damage when they're in this city, and we enjoy that very much. So in any case, any reading above 50 here means that architects are busier this month than they were the previous month. Well, look at the data here. In June, they were busier than they were in May, April, March, February, January. I think you know what the months are. The point is, design professionals are pretty busy right now. And again, this is a leading indicator because if the notion is very simple. If design professionals are busy upstream, contractors are more likely to be busy downstream. But I wonder why there is so much design work taking place, given the data I'm about to show you. And my feeling is that one of the reasons there's so much design work is because capitalists have so much capital to deploy right now. I'll give you an example. If you're in a private equity firm, and you've got investors sending you money to invest, you can't just be sitting in 10-year treasuries yielding 2.6%. They're looking for more yield and creativity for you. Now, one of the places to invest capital, of course, is real estate. And when money is invested in real estate, that often translates into construction as properties are built or repositioned in the market. So lots of design work taking place right now as capital is looking to deploy itself. But I would suggest to you that the historical relationship between architectural billings, design work generally, and the amount of construction to transpire has been altered. That a lot of these projects, for reasons I'm going to get into right now, will not move forward even though they've been designed. And one of the reasons for this is simply the function of the economy. I'll give you an example. This is the US office vacancy rate. You don't see any sign of recovery here. There's a company called Castle Systems. They provide security for 2,000 buildings in the United States of America. And one of the things that they do is they issue key cards to office workers. On the average Monday in June, 30% of those workers swiped into work, 30%. The highest proportion is on Tuesdays, 50%. But people are just not going back to the office, even if they have an office to go back to. I think we have enough office space in this country is what I'm trying to suggest. Not in St. Petersburg, Florida, where the office vacancy rate has been below 5% recently. There's some markets you can find where that's not true, where you could still build more office space and it would be absorbed very quickly. That's true. But that is the exception, not the rule. Now, one of the other things that happened early during the pandemic is, of course, people's spending patterns changed. A number of retailers went bankrupt early during the pandemic, so among them were Pure One Imports, True Religion, Neiman Marcus, JCPenney, J.Crew, GNC, Brooks Brothers, Lord & Taylor, Guitar Center, Francesca's, many others. And with those bankruptcies, those retail bankruptcies, come a wave of store closures. So no surprise when you look up, this is U.S. mall vacancy. We have enough shopping centers in this country. We probably have enough hotel rooms in this country. This is U.S. hotel occupancy. Last three bars here are 2019, 2020, and 2021. And admittedly, 2021 was a year of partial recovery for the U.S. hotel sector, but nowhere close is occupancy to where it had been pre-pandemic. And yes, I understand leisure travel has come back aggressively. And we are evidence that business travel has come back to a certain extent, but not nearly as quickly as many hoteliers would have preferred. There are enough hotel rooms in this country. In fact, there are 16 categories of non-residential construction in our country. All are listed here. And these horizontal bars represent the percentage change in construction spending for each of these categories between February of 2020, just before the pandemic shuts down the economy, to June of 2022, the last month for which we have data. What's at the bottom here? Lodging, that's hotel room construction, down 47.8%. Office is up a few categories from that, down around 13%, despite the fact that the office category encompasses data centers. Now, data center construction has been fast and furious, a backbone of the e-commerce economy. Nonetheless, office construction down. By the way, where do you see the fastest growth in construction spending? Manufacturing. That reshoring story is real. The notion of more supply chain coming back to America is real. When the CEO of Intel announced a few weeks ago that that firm was going to invest $20 billion in the Columbus, Ohio metropolitan area, to construct several chip manufacturing facilities. Those facilities could go anywhere in the world. They could go to Taiwan, they could go to Japan, they could go to the West Coast of the United States, wherever. He chooses the industrial Midwest. Ford Motor then shortly announced it was going to invest $3.7 billion in Ohio, Michigan, and Kansas City, Missouri, largely to build factories to build or manufacture electric vehicles. This reshoring story is real. It's one of the reasons the Chinese economy is slowing so dramatically. Obviously, the real estate crisis there is another factor. So in any case, the point is the economy is changing, in some ways for the worse, in some ways for the better. But when you put it all together, despite the fact that we have lots of data center construction, we've had lots of fulfillment center construction, again, the e-commerce economy, the construction of manufacturing facilities. When you look at the gross domestic product data, this is non-residential fixed investment in structures, you don't see any recovery here. We just got the second quarter data, of course, another quarter during which, in real terms, investment in structures, building construction declines. So again, you've got all that design work taking place, but you don't see that reflected here. And one of the other factors at work here is this. We've got project owners. The project is designed, it's ready to go. They think it's going to work economically. And then they put the project out for bid. And then the bids come in, and then they look at the bids, this project owner, and ask the question, is this for my project? Because these numbers don't look anything like my pro forma. And if these are the numbers, my pro forma does not pencil out. And of course, one of the reasons for this, again, is inflation. This is inputs to construction producer price index data. It's a reflection of what producers or suppliers of construction materials are receiving vis-a-vis what they would have received 12 months earlier. So what I'm trying to say here is that construction materials prices based on this data series are up 20.1% over the past year, 20.1%. Now you can see a bit of a slide. Steel prices have come back down. Lumber prices have come back down a bit. Still high relative to pre-pandemic levels, but some of those prices have come off their peaks. That's true. Nonetheless, 20%. That is enough to trip up many pro formas. And if you add to that the compensation cost increases the contractors face, well, even more so. I can break down these data for you more finely. In fact, I will. This is, again, construction materials producer price index data, 12-month percentage change through June of 2022. So I'm comparing prices in June of 2021 versus June of 2022. Natural gas prices up 224.5%. And obviously that has a lot to do with Vladimir Putin and Ukraine. Crude petroleum price up 77%. Steel mill product price up 22%. Yes, some of these prices have been falling recently. That's true again, but not reflected in the year-over-year numbers. Again, just recognizing that these prices are coming off, in many cases, historic highs. So that's where we are right now. Now, enough of that. That's the foundation. Now I want to get to the forecast. Now, I hope to this point you've enjoyed this James Bond-themed presentation. My name is Anirban, and I promised you some leading economic indicators. Let me give you a handful more. So, again, macroeconomically, question, are we in recession or not? I don't think we are, in part because the consumer is still spending. If I had shown you data on retail sales and some other data, the consumer is still spending. But will they continue to spend at the current level or above the current level? Not so clear. And that's one of the reasons we look at leading indicators like consumer confidence, or in this case, the University of Michigan's Index of Consumer Sentiment. Where is the consumer right now psychologically in America? They are down in the dumps. They are miserable. The American people are miserable. The American people need to listen to John O'Leary. And they do. And the number one factor that has them miserable, it's not midterm elections, it's not Russia, Ukraine, it's inflation, of course. Inflation has them really down. They are getting hammered. And they're not the only ones who are pessimistic. Small Business America is also deeply pessimistic. This is from the National Federation of Independent Business. It's their index of small business optimism. Question, Small Business America, is it a good time to expand your business over the next 3 months? In June, 3% of small business operators said, yes, it's a good time to expand my business. Mind you, many of them would like to expand their business. They observe unmet demand. But if you ask them, is it a good time to expand? No, it is not. I cannot find workers. I can't afford workers. I have rampant turnover. I have equipment shortages. I have elevated materials prices. My margins are thinning out. It is not a good time to expand my business. Now, sometimes these psychological or confidence indicators can be deeply misleading. For instance, we don't actually care that much about what consumers are thinking, feeling, or believing. What we really care about, of course, is what they are doing. And what they have been doing is complaining to the surveyors, I'm miserable as an American, I'm angry as an American, I drive angry, I cut people off, it makes me feel better. But I can't talk any further about these issues with you because I'm going shopping. If you look at this, the US manufacturers' new orders for consumer goods, you don't see any slowdown here in spending. None. Oh, I know you've heard about Walmart and Target. There probably is some evidence that people in the lower quintiles of income, people who have been hit harder by gasoline prices and food prices and rent increases, are pulling back on spending. That's true, including on discretionary items. That's true. But the aggregate consumer segment, I'll give you an example. Look, I understand very well that this is a premium audience. I get that. CII. This is 93 octane all the way. I get that. So you've been paying more than $5 a gallon for quite some time. And my guess is when you're filling up at $5 a gallon at the pump, you're saying to yourself, when I leave this gas station, I better have the roads to myself. I am paying for exclusivity, but you have no exclusivity. Traffic is as bad as ever because we are consuming as many gallons of gasoline this year as we did last year when prices were much lower. Many of you flew to get here, to Cleveland, Ohio, which beautiful city, by the way. Cleveland, Ohio. And the plane was full. But airfares are way up over the past year. Nonetheless, we are traveling, we are spending. Now, will that continue? Well, job openings are falling. My guess is job growth will slow. But still, there is some upbeat data out there. You'll find many economists who will say that not only are we not in recession, we're not headed to recession anytime soon. Many economists. One of the reasons for this is we see some good data. This is from the Philadelphia Federal Reserve. This is their Manufacturing Business Outlook Survey. And this pertains to expected future delivery times over the next 6 months. What this is saying is that delivery time is expected to fall. Now, the question becomes, are they expected to fall because demand is expected to dry up or because the supply chain is improving? Maybe a combination of the two. When you look at the Conference Board's Index of Leading Economic Indicators, so this is 10 leading indicators in their own right, all bundled into one composite index, yes, it's true, the readings have been falling recently, but they're still high. So you'll find many economists suggest that the risk of recession is less than 50%. And that takes me to my final slide. If you're an economist, you only forecast twice. I forecast at the beginning of the year, of course, And that's the forecast I'm sharing with you now. And then I'll forecast at the end of the year, and my forecast will become whatever actually transpired. And in that way, I'm always proven correct. I get invited back to speak at CII. So this will be a year of growth, but I think 2023 will be very different. A year of nominal growth. So in real terms, of course, GDP has been declining, but we've added jobs. We've grown nominally, once you don't adjust for inflation, for instance. But watch out for next year. I think you'll see a fair amount of job loss. You'll see very poor GDP performance in nominal and real terms. And why is that? The Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is trying to engineer this soft landing, slowing the economy, ridding the economy of excess inflation while trying to prevent a recession. They do that largely by playing with interest rates, raising interest rates. We've had 8 previous rate tightening cycles, interest rate hiking cycles, since the early 1980s. 6 have ended in recession. They do not have a good record of engineering soft landings. I don't think they can get this done. There's just not enough room to maneuver there. The economy is already soft and inflation is sky high. On top of that, the economy will remain unbalanced with supply starting to keep up with demand. Yes, I understand. I just talked about supply chain improving, but you still have Ukraine, Russia, and these serious lockdowns in China as they pursue their zero-COVID policy. Along with rising wages amidst the great resignation, that unbalanced economy translates into higher than average economy-wide inflation in 2022. That deserves a big fat duh, obviously. But I think inflation will be less at the end of this year than it is presently, no longer 9%, but still in the range of 5 to 6%, I suspect. And the Federal Reserve, therefore, will not be able to loosen its reins on money supply or monetary policy anytime soon. And then, yes, I'm an economist, so I'm forecasting short-term interest rates to increase. Long-term interest rates have been actually declining. But the Federal Reserve is very hawkish in its language. It's saying to people, we're very serious about inflation, more rate hikes to come, and that will drive us into recession. And about that, when that occurs, when we start to see the data really get bad in terms of job growth, unemployment, so on and so forth, or at least worse, there will be no debate, we'll be in recession. That's what's going to happen either later this year or 2023. Of course, I could be wrong. I'm an economist. And with that, just want to point out, if you're interested in such data, I have a newsletter at basu.substack.com. There's a free service here, so I'm not just dialing for dollars. And of course, if you're not interested, please feel free to pound sand. And with that, thank you very much for the opportunity. It's been a privilege. God bless.
All right, thank you very much. Well, we have lots of questions.
Bring them.
All right, so obviously in our industry, it can take a number of years, months from planning to commitment of funds to execution to complete. What escalation rates should we expect to use for these multi-year, multi-million type of projects?
This is a really tough question, obviously. There's so many different types of projects, so many different materials used, whether concrete or steel or whatever it happens to be. But I believe this to be the case. I did a study recently for a university in Tennessee, and they're considering the pace of their construction build-up, their capital program. And the question on the table was, do you think that over the next 3 years, there'll be an opportunity for us to purchase construction services at a lower price or more advantageous price than we would pay right now if we move forward right now? And my conclusion was yes. That at some point, contractors will be more aggressive in their bids because there'll be less work. Again, this is consistent with my prediction of recession, that materials prices will fall further in many cases. And that now, they also asked a bunch of other economists the same question. And those economists disagreed with me. They said, no, because with this generally high rate of inflation, that you won't save much money, if at all, that it might make sense just to go forward. So lots of different opinions here. I'm of the mind that the next recession will be fairly deep, and that's going to bring some deflationary pressures to the construction industry and some other parts of the economy. We're starting to see some of that already play out. And again, a lot of this has to do with the weakness in China, the Chinese economy, the European economy, and increasingly the US economy. So that's my answer to your question. Maybe I'm right, maybe I'm wrong. I hope no one holds me accountable. No one ever has.
All right. The next question is about public versus private employment. Do you have a comparison from the public versus private employment cost index, and who gained more out of those two?
Right, so the question, public versus private. So I showed you, the wage numbers I showed you were for private sector workers. generally speaking, government workers have not seen the increase in compensation that private sector workers have. Remember, a lot of the increase in compensation has been among entry-level and near entry-level workers in the private sector. So that's your fulfillment center worker, somebody who was used to make $11 an hour now makes $17 an hour, that kind of thing over the course of the pandemic. We have not seen that kind of dynamic in the public sector. In fact, in terms of employment, the private sector is now more than fully recovered, but the public sector is down by more than 600,000 jobs. So public sector hiring has been weak, and compensation increases have not been particularly aggressive, given that so many elected officials have been quite nervous about fiscal circumstances, even though many state and local governments are actually flush with cash.
Okay, so we have dumped so much U.S. dollar currency into the market over the past few years in the pandemic. What is your view on should we focus on removing that extra cash in circulation instead of interest rate increases, or is the Federal Reserve taking the right step, I guess?
Right, so the question is, we added abundantly to our money supply, and one would have thought that the US dollar would have really suffered in terms of value, given that we've expanded supply so much. Look today, a euro can only buy $1.02 US. A few weeks ago, we were almost at parity with the euro. It's the first time that had happened in a couple of decades. And so, today, the US dollar can buy 131 Japanese yen. I mean, the dollar is very strong. So, even despite all that, we have all this inflation. But through it all, the dollars come out of this smelling like a rose. It is the best house in the bad neighborhood. It is still the global reserve currency. It is still the strongest currency. It's stronger than the euro, the yen, the Canadian dollar, you name it. And so what can I tell you? I think the Federal Reserve doesn't have to worry so much about that, the value of the US dollar, but they overdid it by a long shot. And so we could be in a better circumstance than we are if the Federal Reserve had gotten this right. And again, hindsight is 20/20, but they have a mandate, 2% inflation, right? The peg inflation, and they messed up. They didn't get that done. That's failure.
So going back to employment, you had spoke about people wanting remote work, working from home versus the office. Have you studied any data on productivity of people remote working versus in the office, and how does it impact organizations?
Right. So there have been lots of studies, as it turns out, before the pandemic, on the productivity of remote workers versus non-remote workers. And many of those studies found, for instance, a study back in the 20-teens out of China, a company literally split its workforce in half, very large workforce. Half went remote, half worked in the old-fashioned at the job site way. And they found that the workers who were working remotely were far more productive. Early during the pandemic, US productivity growth surges as more Americans work from home. Now, the question then becomes, can that productivity impetus persist? I don't think so. I think once you work from home long enough, you start taking things for granted, right? Early during the pandemic, a lot of people were worried about losing their jobs. They were sent to work from home, and they want to prove to their employers, I can still be responsible in my slippers. I think over time, as people work from home, the fact of the matter is they become sloppier. Companies probably become also less innovative. And by the way, a lot of these major corporate companies are embracing hybrid models where you can come to the office or not. It's your choice. And my very strong sense is that the people who are going to get bonuses and raises and promotions are the folks who show up at the office, network, communicate, and really feel engaged and are engaged. So I don't think this productivity bump that we've seen from remote work will persist. In fact, I expect it to reverse itself, but it has not reversed itself in the data just yet.
So sticking on the labor topic, you presented us major challenges to the construction labor market after COVID. So how do we attract these new type of workers, and who, the millennials in particular, and who are really not motivated by money and are not interested in working in the construction field?
Yeah, the millennials are a lost cause as far as I'm concerned. Really, I mean, what a
I'm
waste,
one of them, technically.
A waste of a generation, I know, but it's not all of them. There are 8 to 10 of them that are pretty decent people, but for the most part, but Gen Y is the millennials. Gen Z is the generation now that's the youngest members of the workforce. The oldest of that group, I think, is either 24 or 25, depending on how you define generations. And they're largely in school right now. And this generation, which is not a large generation, by the way, in terms of population, but it's an important generation nonetheless, as they all are, has grown up during the period of the student debt crisis. And many of them have concluded, I do not want to burden myself with student debt. I don't want to do that. I've seen my older brothers and sisters suffer that. I've seen parents suffer. I don't want to do that. And so this generation is now looking, in many cases, for alternative pathways to prosperity. The millennials grew up with a period where if you want to be prosperous in America, you have to get a 4-year college degree, period, end of story, and in tech or engineering, something like that. This generation is growing up, I can be successful in all kinds of ways. I want to find a pathway to prosperity that fits me. And so this is a generation that the construction industry really needs to glom onto, really address them in middle school and high school, at the 2-year college level, to try to point out to them that there are these pathways to prosperity that allow you to see tangible output for your efforts, not just a report sitting on somebody's desk, but actually building skylines, improving our built environment, making our nation stronger, more resilient, cleaner, greener. And that you should actually at least consider these pathways. And so that's I think, what the construction industry has to do. Of course, one of the things that the construction industry is also going to do, more labor-saving technology, right? Whether it's robotics or 3D printing, driverless vehicles, that's coming too.
All right, well, that's all we have time for. Thank you very much, Anirban, for a great presentation.